we got today, a topic of conversation that a lot of people aren't really talking about right now. Edgar Berlanga, right? After the Canelo Alvarez fight, he still had momentum, and it seemed like he lost all of his momentum after that tough loss against Hamzah Sheeraz. Can he make a comeback? What does his future look like at the 168-pound division? We're going to get into that right now. Before I dive into some ways that Edgar Berlanga can make a comeback in 2026, we got to know what he's coming from to know where he can go in the sport of boxing. Prior to him facing Canelo Alvarez, he was a guy that was beating up guys, hurting guys, stopping guys, getting guys out of there, right? Moved up in competition, facing Canelo Alvarez and looked like a deer in headlights. Dropped in the third round, lost a unanimous decision, and then right after was able to get a soft touch against a guy who didn't look in shape throughout the build-up, throughout the weigh-in, or throughout the fight, right? Similar to what I was saying about Caleb Plant not getting those type of opportunities, not getting soft touches to get him prepared for bigger fights, right? After that soft touch, he made easy work of that guy, as he should. He beat a guy up that he should beat up. He stepped up again in competition with Hamzah Sheeraz, a guy moving up who just had a tough fight, which I personally felt like he lost against Carlos Adames, right? And I'm talking about got obliterated. It didn't even look like he should have been in the ring with a guy like Hamzah Sheeraz, right? So we got to take all that into account, before we even dive into, what I think about him and Resendiz going forward. Berlanga cannot take a guy like Armando Resendiz lightly. We seen in the last performance with him and Caleb Plant, he was a plus 1100 underdog. And went in there and worked his strategy and his game plan to a T and earned that victory, right? What we don't see, especially right now in the sport of boxing, is Hispanic fighters that work behind the jab. Armando Resendiz works behind his jabs, 1-2 combinations, goes to the body, especially on the inside. He's not just a guy on the inside looking for shots upstairs. He's able to throw shots downstairs, right? So he's very versatile in the ring. I believe that can give a guy like Edgar Berlanga problems, especially coming off that devastating loss against Hamzah. Unfortunately, in boxing, you're only as good as your last fight. And Edgar Berlanga's last fight was against Hamzah Sheeraz, where he not only was outclassed, he was beat up and hurt bad, right? Especially coming off a knockout win, a touch-up, to get him prepared, get him back his confidence in there. He didn't look like he had any confidence in there, right? Fighting in quicksand, his mobility in the ring was non-existent, right? From round one to the end of the fight, fighting in a high guard, not moving around in the ring, not working off a jab, not throwing combinations, looking for one shot at a time. And he wasn't able to be first at all in that fight. All of those things can work against him, against a guy like Resendiz, who is a pretty solid boxer. Another problem for Edgar Berlanga coming into this fight with Resendiz is that, he doesn't look in shape. He runs out of gas. He runs out of stamina. He runs out of energy. And all of these things can play against him, against a guy like Resendiz, where we seen in Resendiz's last fight, he looked like he was still ready to go 10, 11, and 12. He still looked fresh. After that fight, Resendiz looked like he hadn't even been in a fight. He didn't look tired. He didn't look worn out. And like I said before, that type of fighter can give a guy like Edgar Berlanga problems, especially coming off that devastating loss. Edgar Berlanga, this is a must-win fight. It is a winnable fight, especially if in this training camp, he's working on fighting with a strategy, fighting with tactics, working behind a jab, to set up shots, not just being flat-footed, fighting in quicksand, working on his mobility. Like I said before, the key word for Edgar Berlanga to win a fight like this is strategy. He has to come in this fight with a strategy. If not, he's going to lose. Resendiz, like I said before, he's a solid boxer. He knows how to work behind his jab. He knows how to throw combinations. He knows how to throw shots on the inside, not just looping lefts and looping rights. He sets those looping lefts and looping rights up off of his jab. I believe that can give Berlanga a problem, especially if he hasn't learned anything new in this training camp, right? I believe he can win this fight because don't forget, Edgar Berlanga still has power. Both of these guys like to fight on the inside. Both of these guys like to trade. right? So he has a puncher's chance, but you know, if he hasn't, you know, put himself in a position to, you know, refine some of the tools that he already has in this fight, ultimately we're gonna see, you know, maybe Edgar Berlanga get stopped again or lose again. And unfortunately, another loss for Edgar Berlanga, like I said before, it'll reduce him to a fighter that sells fights based off a Puerto Rican flag and nothing more.